I always knew Winston was different from other boys his age. He carried himself with quiet grace, never the loudest in the room, never the one to push his way into the center of attention. He was observant, thoughtful, and maybe a little too careful with his words, as if the wrong ones might somehow betray him. At 19 he had just begun dating a girl, Charlotte. She was sweet, soft-spoken like him, with long auburn hair that tumbled over her shoulders and a shy smile that Winston had taken to mirroring whenever he spoke about her. It warmed me to see him stepping into this new chapter of his life, but I could also see the hesitation in his eyes. So I did what I had always done, I talked to him. It started as casual conversations in the kitchen while I cooked, him leaning against the counter, arms crossed over his chest, the faint scent of his aftershave lingering in the air. He told me about their first date at the diner down on Sycamore Street, how he worried he had talked too much about his history class, how she had laughed at his awkward jokes. "She makes me nervous, Mom," he admitted one evening, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's not a bad thing," I replied, stirring the pot on the stove. "It just means you care." He sighed as if the weight of those words settled too deeply into his bones. "I just don't want to mess things up." I set my spoon down, turning to face him. "Winston, love isn't about perfection. It's about understanding, about learning someone little by little." I gave him a small smile. "You've got a good heart. Trust it." His gaze met mine, searching for something, maybe reassurance, maybe the certainty I couldn't quite give. But then he nodded, as if my words had reached some part of him that needed to hear them. Our house in Ohio had always been steady, predictable. Mick and I had built a good life together. We weren't the couple that needed grand gestures or endless declarations of love. Instead, we found comfort in the little things. His hand on the small of my back as I passed him in the kitchen, the way he brought me coffee before I even asked. And Winston had grown up seeing that. I often wondered what kind of love he would come to know. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the living room, Winston sat on the couch, staring at his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen, his expression unreadable. "You're overthinking again," I teased, tossing a towel onto the pile. He glanced up, startled, then let out a breathy chuckle. "Is it that obvious?" I walked over and sat beside him, peering at the phone. A half-typed message lingered on the screen. "Charlotte," I guessed. He nodded, rubbing his temples. "I don't know what to say. She seemed quiet last night and I want to check in, but I don't want to come off as clingy." I smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Winston, caring about someone isn't clingy. It's kindness." He considered my words, then sighed. "What if she thinks I'm too much?" I shook my head. "The right person will never make you feel like you're too much." For a moment he just looked at me, his blue eyes soft with gratitude. Then without another word he typed his message and hit send. I watched him exhale, his shoulders relaxing as if some invisible weight had lifted. Love was complicated. But I hoped that with every word, every lesson, he would learn that it was worth it. The hardest part of being a mother wasn't the late nights or the worry. It was the letting go. One evening Mick and I sat outside on the porch, the air warm with the lingering scent of honeysuckle. Winston had just left to pick up Charlotte, and as I watched the taillights disappear down the road, I felt something shift inside me. "He's growing up," Mick said, reading my thoughts. I nodded, swallowing against the tightness in my throat. "I know." Mick reached for my hand, his thumb brushing against my wrist. "You did good, Gina." I let out a small laugh, shaking my head. "He's the one doing good. I'm just trying to keep up." Mick squeezed my hand and we sat there in comfortable silence, the hum of crickets filling the space between us. And I realized then that love, whether it was the love of a mother, a wife, or a young man just finding his way, wasn't about holding on too tight. It was about knowing when to let go, when to trust, and when to simply be there waiting whenever they needed you. Winston came home just past 10, his car pulling into the driveway with a slow, deliberate halt. From the porch where I sat with a book in my lap, I could already tell something was wrong. The way he shut the car door, not with his usual care but with a sharp push, sent a quiet signal. By the time he walked up the steps, his shoulders were tense, his jaw locked. He barely glanced at me before muttering, "Night, Mom," and heading straight inside. I set my book aside. "Winston." He stopped but didn't turn around. "Talk to me." For a moment I thought he might ignore me, retreat upstairs and let his frustration fester. But then he sighed, a heavy, weary sound, and turned to face me. "She said she needed space." I nodded slowly, gesturing to the empty seat next to me. He hesitated, then sat down, elbows resting on his knees. That's not necessarily a bad thing, I said gently. Space doesn't mean it's over. Then why does it feel like it? He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. I don't even know what I did wrong. She just seemed distant all night. And when I asked if something was bothering her, she just said she needed time to think. I placed a hand on his back, rubbing slow, soothing circles. Sometimes, people don't always know how to say what's really bothering them. Maybe it's not even about you, Winston. Maybe she's just working through something. But I want to fix it, he muttered. I smiled softly. I know. But love isn't something you fix, sweetheart. Something you nurture. And sometimes that means giving someone the time to figure things out. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I hate feeling like this. I leaned over and kissed his temple the way I used to when he was little. I know, baby. But trust me, it's not the end. Still, despite my words, I could see he wasn't feeling any better. I thought for a moment, then reached for my phone. What are you doing? He asked, watching as I dialed. I'm calling Charlotte. Mom. I held up a hand to silence him. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Mrs. Harper? Charlotte's voice was soft, hesitant. Hi, sweetheart, I said warmly. I was wondering if you'd like to come over tomorrow evening. I was planning a little treat for the two of you. There was a pause. I don't know if. It's just for a bit, I assured her. I'll pick you up at 6 and we can talk. No pressure. Another pause, then finally, okay. Good girl, I said, smiling. I'll see you then. When I hung up, Winston looked at me, incredulous. You just. She'll be here at 6, I said, patting his knee before standing. Now go to bed. It'll all make sense tomorrow. The next evening, Winston and I drove to pick up Charlotte. She was standing outside her house when we arrived, arms folded, looking a little unsure. When she slid into the back seat, she murmured a soft, hi, to Winston, who nodded but didn't say much. I took the lead. We're going to a little place I love. Quiet, cozy, perfect for talking. Neither of them objected, and soon, we arrived at a small coffee shop tucked away from the main roads. It was a place Mick and I used to visit when we first started dating, back when we were still learning each other's rhythms. We ordered drinks and settled into a corner booth. All right, I said, folding my hands. I know things feel a little uncertain between you two right now. So I thought maybe hearing a story would help. Winston frowned. Mom. I ignored his protest and turned to Charlotte. Did Winston ever tell you about how Mick and I met? Charlotte shook her head. I smiled, taking a sip of my tea before beginning. I met Mick when I was just a little older than you two. I thought I had everything figured out. But relationships aren't like that. They're messy and complicated, and sometimes they feel impossible. Mick wasn't like the other guys I had dated. He was patient, steady, and so sure of me that it scared me. I pushed him away more times than I care to admit because I was afraid of the seriousness of it all. But do you know what he did? Charlotte shook her head again, her gaze locked onto mine. He gave me space. But he also let me know he wasn't going anywhere. I reached over and squeezed her hand gently. Love isn't always smooth, sweetheart. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to need time. But what matters is how you handle that fear. Do you shut him out completely? Or do you let him in just a little, even if you're still figuring things out? Charlotte's eyes welled up and she glanced at Winston. I wasn't trying to push you away, she whispered. I got scared. Things were getting serious so fast and I didn't know if I was ready. Winston reached for her hand. I would have waited, he said softly. I just needed to know where we stood. She exhaled shakily. I know. I'm sorry. I smiled, sensing the weight between them beginning to lift. Now that that's settled, I said, I have a surprise for you too. When we got home, I led them into the living room where candles flickered on the coffee table. The scent of vanilla and cinnamon filled the air. There was a bottle of champagne chilling in an ice bucket, a platter of fruit and snacks arranged neatly beside it. Charlotte's eyes widened. Mrs. Harper? I grinned. Mick and I are staying at a friend's house for the weekend. This house is yours until Sunday night. No interruptions, no stress. Just time, to talk, to laugh, to just be together. Winston gaped at me. You're serious? I nodded. I trust you both. I know how important this is for you and I want you to have the chance to reconnect without distractions. Charlotte turned to Winston, smiling softly. This is really sweet. He squeezed her hand. Yeah. It is. Mick came downstairs carrying an overnight bag. He smirked at me. Ready to go? Yep, I said, tossing my own bag over my shoulder. Enjoy yourselves, kids. And remember, relationships aren't about getting everything right. They're about learning together. As we walked out the door, I turned back one last time to see Winston pulling Charlotte into a warm embrace. And I knew without a doubt that they were going to be just fine. When Mick and I returned home Sunday evening, the house was quiet, but the warmth still lingered in the air. The soft scent of vanilla from the candles I had left behind still clung to the space, mingling with the faint traces of laughter that had filled the walls just hours earlier. Winston had already dropped Charlotte off at home, but I didn't have to ask how their weekend had gone. I could see it in the way he moved, the lightness in his step, the absent-minded smile he wore as he stacked dishes in the sink. "Hey kid," I called as I set my overnight bag down. Winston turned, and the grin that stretched across his face told me everything I needed to know. "It was great, Mom," he said, shaking his head as if he still couldn't believe it. "Better than great, actually." I leaned against the counter, waiting for him to tell me everything. "We just had fun," he said, still beaming. "Like real fun. We cooked together." "Okay, well, mostly I watched while she cooked, but it was fun. We stayed up late talking, listening to music. We made stupid little inside jokes about how neither of us knows how to open a bottle of champagne properly." He chuckled. "She got all giggly when it popped and it just—" He paused, exhaling deeply, his expression softening. "It felt different, Mom. Like before I knew I liked her, but this weekend, I felt it." I smiled, reaching out to smooth a strand of his hair, something I'd done since he was little, though now he was nearly a foot taller than me. "That's what time together does," I said. "It lets you see the little things, the quiet moments that don't always show up on dates or in text. It's how you learn who a person really is." Winston nodded, his smile not fading. He seemed lighter than he had in days, and I knew deep in my heart that this weekend had been the beginning of something real for him and Charlotte. Then, with a teasing gleam in his eyes, he leaned against the counter and asked, "Gina, maybe you know some other interesting tricks for young couples?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Oh honey, you have no idea." Mick walked in at that moment, raising a brow. "What are you two conspiring about now?" Winston smirked. "Mom's about to give me some special tricks for relationships." Mick chuckled, dropping his bag by the door. "Oh boy. If she starts telling you about the Harper family love philosophy, run while you still can." I rolled my eyes and swatted Mick's arm. "Oh hush. You're part of this philosophy too, you know." Winston laughed. "All right, Mom. What's this important thing you're going to show me tonight?" After dinner, I led Winston to the living room. The fireplace crackled softly, filling the room with a gentle warmth. I handed him an old leather-bound journal, its edges worn, its pages slightly yellowed with time. "This," I said, watching as he ran his fingers over the cover, "is the most important trick I can teach you." Winston frowned, flipping it open. His eyes skimmed the pages, filled with careful cursive handwriting, some in my hand, some in Mick's. "What is this?" he asked, puzzled. "It's our relationship journal," I said. "Mick and I started it when we got married. We write in it whenever we learn something important about love, about each other, about life. It's not just about the big things, it's the little things too. The things that remind us why we chose each other." Winston flipped through the pages, pausing on small notes in Mick's writing. "Never leave the house without a kiss goodbye. It might seem small, but it matters more than you think. When she's having a bad day, don't always try to fix it. Sometimes she just needs you to sit with her in the mess. She likes red roses, but she loves wildflowers. Never forget the wildflowers." Winston blinked. "You guys actually write in this?" "Of course," I said. "Because love isn't just something that happens to you. It's something you build. And sometimes it helps to remind yourself how you got here." Winston was silent for a moment, his fingers still tracing the edges of the book. Then he smiled. "This is actually kinda cool," he admitted. "It's like a blueprint." I nodded. "Exactly. No relationship is perfect, but when you have something to remind you why you started, it makes it easier to keep going." He looked up at me, thoughtful. "Do you think Charlotte and I could have something like this one day?" I smiled, squeezing his hand. "If you treat her with kindness, respect, and honesty, then yes. Absolutely." That night, after Winston had gone to bed, Mick and I sat together in the dim glow of the living room. He wrapped an arm around me, pulling me close. "You did good, Gina," he murmured. I rested my head on his shoulder, watching the flames flicker in the fireplace. "He's a good kid. He just needed a little guidance." Mick chuckled. "A little? You basically gave him a full-blown masterclass in love." I smirked. "Hey, someone had to do it." We sat there in comfortable silence, the weight of years together settling between us like a familiar embrace. I thought about Winston, about the way his eyes had lit up when he talked about Charlotte, about the quiet hope in his voice when he asked if they could have something real. I knew love wasn't always easy. I knew there would be challenges ahead for him, moments of doubt, moments where he might wonder if he was doing things right. But I also knew this: he had a good heart. He was thoughtful, patient, and willing to learn. And no matter what happened, he wouldn't have to figure it out alone. Because I would always be here. To listen, to guide, to remind him of the things that truly mattered. That was what mothers did. That was what love was. The next morning I woke up feeling lighter than I had in days. Maybe it was the knowledge that Winston and Charlotte had found their rhythm again, or maybe it was the sheer joy of seeing my son so happy. Either way, I knew I wanted to do something special for them, something that would bring them even closer. So after breakfast I picked up my phone and called Charlotte. "Good morning, sweetheart," I greeted warmly. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper," she replied, her voice still a little sleepy but sweet as ever. "I was wondering if you'd like to come over today," I said. "I have a little surprise planned for you and Winston." She hesitated. "A surprise?" I chuckled. "Don't worry, it's nothing crazy. Just a little lesson in relaxation if you're interested." There was a soft giggle on the other end. "All right. I'll be there." After hanging up, I turned to Winston, who was leaning against the kitchen counter, finishing his coffee. "Charlotte's coming over," I told him. "We're going to do something fun today." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh no. What are you up to now?" I smirked. "You'll see." While waiting for Charlotte to arrive, I got to work setting up my bedroom. I wanted the atmosphere to be perfect. Relaxing, inviting, something that felt completely different from the usual routine of their young relationship. I pulled out my softest white sheets, lit several scented candles and scattered rose petals over the bed. I dimmed the lights and closed the curtains, allowing only the flickering candlelight to dance across the room. Then I played soft instrumental music, something with gentle piano and nature sounds in the background. By the time I was done, the room felt like a spa, a small oasis of peace. Just as I stepped back to admire my work, I heard the doorbell ring. Perfect timing. I opened the door to find Charlotte standing there, looking lovely in a simple white sundress. She smiled shyly. "Hi, Mrs. Harper." I stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "Come in, dear. Winston's just in the living room." She walked inside and Winston immediately stood up from the couch, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Hey," he said, stepping forward to give her a quick hug. I watched them for a moment, amused by how natural their affection had become. "All right, lovebirds," I said, clapping my hands together. "Follow me." They exchanged confused glances but followed me down the hall nonetheless. When I opened the door to my bedroom, Charlotte gasped softly, her eyes wide as she took in the setting. "Whoa," Winston said, looking around. "This is different." I chuckled. "Welcome to your first massage lesson." Charlotte turned to me, surprised. "Massage lesson?" I nodded. "One of the best things you can learn in a relationship is how to take care of each other. Not just emotionally but physically too. Touch is powerful. It's about connection, relaxation, and trust." Winston and Charlotte exchanged another glance, this time filled with curiosity. I smiled. "Come on, let's get started." I guided them toward the bed, where I had placed a few neatly folded towels and a bottle of massage oil. "Now before we begin," I said, "let me show you something important." I turned toward Winston. "Press your fingers gently into my shoulder, right here." He hesitated for a moment, then did as I asked, applying light pressure to the muscle. "Good," I said, nodding. "This is one of the most important points of tension in the body. If you ever want to help someone relax, focus on the shoulders first." Charlotte watched closely, fascinated. I smiled at her. "Now let's try something fun. Winston, lie down on your stomach." He shot me a wary glance. "What?" I laughed. "Relax. You're going to be Charlotte's practice model." Charlotte giggled and Winston sighed dramatically but did as he was told, settling onto the bed. I turned to Charlotte, handing her the bottle of massage oil. All right, sweetheart. Pour a little into your hands, rub them together to warm it up, and then place your palms on his back. She hesitated, then did as I instructed, placing her hands gently on Winston's shoulders. Good, I encouraged. Now start with slow, broad strokes. Use your whole palm, not just your fingers. Think of it like spreading warmth across his skin. As she moved her hands along his back, Winston let out a surprised sigh. Oh, that actually feels good. Charlotte giggled. Yeah. I smiled. See, it's all about intention. Massage isn't just about rubbing muscles. It's about making the other person feel safe, relaxed. Charlotte continued, listening to my instructions as I guided her through different techniques. How to use her thumbs to work out knots. How to apply gentle pressure without causing discomfort. She was a quick learner and I could see the enjoyment in both of them. After a while I stepped back. All right, I think you've got it down. Winston, how do you feel? He groaned happily. Like I never want this to end. Charlotte laughed. I guess I did okay then. You did more than okay, he murmured, turning his head to look up at her. I watched them for a moment, seeing the way they were looking at each other. Soft, full of unspoken understanding. All right, time to switch, I announced, breaking the moment. Winston sat up, stretching lazily. Wait, you mean I have to do it now? I raised an eyebrow. What, you thought you were just going to be spoiled all evening? Charlotte smirked. Yeah, Winston. Your turn. He sighed, but there was no real protest in his voice. Charlotte sat down on the edge of the bed and I showed Winston how to massage her feet. A simple but incredibly relaxing technique. I guided his movements, showing him how to press gently along the arches, how to use his thumbs to apply just the right amount of pressure. Charlotte closed her eyes, letting out a little hum of contentment. This is nice, she murmured. Winston chuckled. Guess I have a new skill now. I grinned. And an important one at that. By the time the lesson ended, they were both relaxed, happy, and even more comfortable with each other. Thank you for this, Charlotte said softly, turning to me. I never realized how much something like this could mean. I smiled, squeezing her hand. It's the little things that build love, sweetheart. Always remember that. As Winston walked her to the door later that night, I stayed back, watching as they stood outside, whispering and laughing together. Love wasn't just about grand gestures. It was about understanding, learning, and most of all, giving. And as I saw my son press a soft kiss to Charlotte's forehead before she left, I knew that he had learned something valuable today, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life.